Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Ask Zajef Ganyu Edition. First things first, where does Ganyu stand in the meta currently, especially when compared to the other units that have been released in the year and a half since her debut, and can she still be called a top 3 DPS? Ganyu kind of stands in the same place where she used to, but I don't think she ever used to be as good as people thought she was. The biggest issue that we had at that time, a lot of the non-traditional, hyper carry teams were just very underrated back then. Right? You could have done Child Bennett, Sucrose Shangling, you could have done Taser stuff. Point being, there were a lot of stuff that I would probably have or consider to be better than Ganyu that doesn't use new things that came out after Ganyu. Hoyoverse has released a lot more actual carry units that are meant to be on-field damage dealers than we had before. So I would say that sure, she was top 3 DPS, and I guess sure, she's not top 3 DPS anymore, but it's not that she's worse than she was, it's just that we now have more options for the actual optimal stuff. Ganyu is just not a unit that I would recommend for people in general. There's two specific scenarios where if that's a scenario that applies to you, Ganyu can be a very valuable unit to go for, but otherwise I would generally just not go for her. Well, I guess 3 if we include just you like the character, which I'm not going to talk about, but obviously if you like the character, don't let me stop you. There's two real situations. So situation number 1 is you want to play some good Venti teams. And then, yeah, she's a pretty solid choice for that. She's not the only one you have. I think there's a few, specifically Venti Kazuha combos that people underestimate a lot for situations like that, but it's still definitely a very solid option. And the other option is you want to have one unit that does everything. So what's really valuable about Ganyu is that she has solid teams, but also, because she's so not burst reliant, then if you're fighting very squishy enemies, you can just spam your charge shots and it's fine. When it comes to overworld stuff, overworld optimization is kind of a joke, because you don't need to optimize, but overworld comfort isn't. Right? Being able to just not feel like your commissions are sucking the life out of you because you're tired of doing the same shit over and over. I'd say that has some value. And I'd say that Ganyu definitely has that aspect of just being such a good overworld unit because she has really big range and a lot of her damage can come just from holding your mouse one button. And if you want to have a unit that does that, but that is still a very good unit in Abyss, then Ganyu is a unit you should potentially consider. If you're fine having different teams for Overworld and in Abyss, I'd say that that's probably not something that would apply to you. Because there's other units that are comfortable in Overworld. It's just none that are as consistent in Abyss while still being comfortable in Overworld like that. So all this to say, I think she's strong. A lot of her value comes from quality of life features like the Overworld stuff and the domain stuff, whatever, and from mobbing stuff with Venti. How does Ganyu compare against Ayaka? What are her strengths and weaknesses? And which is a better pull over the other? And should you pull for one if you already have the other? Okay. I'd say that as a general rule, Ayaka is just better than Ganyu. Ayaka doesn't have nearly as much comfort in Overworld, nor does she have quite the same shredding capabilities against rooms of enemies when paired with Venti. But in exchange, she's better in AoE against enemies that aren't pullable with Venti. She's better in single target in most situations. It's kind of just more damage in exchange for that. When it comes to meta and how much they will improve your account and your performance and all that, I would basically always recommend Ayaka over Ganyu. And when it comes to Melt teams, I'd recommend Ganyu over Ayaka, kind of, but I also wouldn't recommend Ganyu Melt over just playing other teams that use Bennett. So the same argument applies where you don't actually gain something from adding her to your account because you'd be better off using another unit instead of Ganyu in that slot. But it is definitely still something she can do. Should you pull one if you already have the other? Unless you just like them both, no, I wouldn't. When is Ganyu a good or bad pull? I'd say she's never either. She's never an amazing pull and she's never a terrible pull. She's always just okay-age. And if the comfort in Overworld is something you care about, then yeah, she becomes a good pull for you specifically. Weapon overview for both Freeze and Melt. So as a general rule, I would stick to Prototype Crescent on Ganyu. The reason why is because Prototype Crescent is a very good weapon both in Freeze and in Melt. The passive on Prototype Crescent is just so fucking good. It's so many stats that even when you're playing it in Melt where you're running with Bennett, so you have a lot of attack anyways, because it's so many stats, it's still a good weapon. That being said though, Hamayumi will generally slightly outperform Prototype Crescent if you have your burst up and you're not using it, which is generally what happens in Melt teams. And sometimes you won't be able to charge shot the enemy, so Hamayumi is also a good option. I think that one thing that's like a pretty massive misconception about Ganyu is people think that like she has this huge reliance on her 5-star weapons. But the reality is that the difference between her best 5-star and her best 4-star in Freeze, her best 4-star is Prototype Crescent, it's less than 10%, which is like really low compared to a lot of the other like 5-star weapons increases. And then when you look at Melt teams, it's also about 10%. It used to be like about 5, but Hunter's Path is now a bit better than the other choices. So now it's closer to 10, but still, right? High Refine Hamayumi and in Melt and High Refine Prototype Crescent in Freeze are almost as good as her best 5-star weapons. It's really nice, right? There's no like massive incentive to try to roll for a weapon because her 4-star weapons are so good. There's still the possibility of going for them. There will be like scenarios and situations where it ends up being a bit more than 10%, yada yada yada. Obviously in Freeze with Prototype Crescent, you're reliant on being able to hit the enemy's weak spot. If you're not able to do that, Prototype Crescent becomes pretty fucking useless, whereas the 5-star weapons don't have that restriction. But still, right? The fact that her 4-star weapons are so close behind her best in slot 5-star is very nice. As a general rule, if you have a 5-star weapon, you can use it because basically all of the 5-star weapons are at least good both in Freeze and Melt, with I guess the exception of Hunter's Path. Hunter's Path has a like massive issue in Freeze where Hunter's Path gives you too much crit. Because with Blizzard Strayer you gain 40%, with Cry Resonance you gain 15, you start at 5, and Hunter's Path gives you 44. You're already over 100%. And that's without counting the possibility of maybe using Rosario on your team. That's without counting Ganyu's like Ascension passive that gives her crit rate on her charge shots after charge shots. That's without counting the fact that you're probably gonna get crit rate in your substats here and there. And because of that, a significant portion of Hunter's Path's passive is just fucking wasted. If you have a way to not waste it, right? If you have a way to literally run no crit substats and then you're at like 104 crit rate, if you do that, then it can become like an okay option. If you get a weak point, it's not even better than High Refined Prototype Crescent. And realistically, you're probably gonna have a bunch of crit in your substats too. It's actually really hard to just get artifacts that only have crit damage and attack percent and no crit rate at all. Like if you're trying to get good artifacts, some of them are gonna have crit rate. And that crit rate roll is like a flat defense roll when you're already over 100%. Point being, generally there's no 5-star weapon that's like bad on her anywhere other than Hunter's Path, and I guess also Polar Star and Skyward Harp if you end up wasting too much of their crit rate passives. So if you have a 5-star weapon, you can generally just stick it on her and leave it there. Other than that, like if you play Freeze Ganyu, Prototype Crescent is incredibly good. And if you play Melt Ganyu, Hamayumi is also incredibly good. Artifact set / stats overview and how much crit rate to aim for in both teams, how much EM is too much in Melt, and how much attack percent to aim for. So, don't play Shimenawas. Shimenawas sucks. Okay, so you can kind of get slightly higher damage out of Shimenawas than out of Wanderers, but there's actually some value in getting the burst. So let's just take a look at Hamayumi. Sorry, I'm gonna call, it was the wrong number. All right, so for set bonuses, okay? This is usual Hamayumi. If you go with, so this is Wanderer's Troop. If you change it to Shimenawa's, it is a little bit higher, right? It's about 3% higher. It's not significantly higher. We also got to keep in mind that with Shimenawa's, you lose the Hamayumi passive. You lose 24% here, so it goes to 26, and you just lose way more. So effectively, I'd say that Shimenawa's isn't a set that you want to go for unless you got a 5-star weapon for your Ganyu, and like I said, I don't think the 5-star weapons are really necessary. Anyways, point being, you can go for either. Generally, I'd recommend Wanderer's Troop though. When it comes to how much crit rate to aim for, just as usual, right? Try to aim for a 1-to-2 ratio. If you're playing her in Melt teams, remember that she gets crit rate, but as usual, right? If you have a slightly less 1-to-2 ratio that gives you more stats because the artifacts are better quality, use that. But in Freeze teams, she gets a lot of crit rate, so just remember to account for 40% from Blizzard Strayer, 15% from Cryo Resonance, and if you have Rosario, up to 15% from that. So either 55 if you don't have Rosaria, or up to 70 if you do, that are not going to be showing up in your stats. And then on top of that, If you're playing a freeze team where you charge attack a lot, that's another 20, so it's 90%. So if you're anything over 10, you're wasting crit. Remember that attack percent is very often going to be better than crit rate in Blizzard Strayer Ganyu builds with freeze teams. However, in melt teams, that is not the case. In melt teams, attack percent is actually not that good because you basically always play her with Bennett. So if we take a look, right, we go back to this. As you can see, you lose like almost 10% DPS from going attack sands instead of EM sands with these assumptions. EM sands is very good for Melt Ganyu, and it's almost always going to be better than attack sands, but in some situations it's so far above attack sands that you actually want to consider using a dog shit EM sands with pretty bad stats over a really good attack sands. Constellation overview. As usual, Constellations aren't worth your money. Only go for them if you have a lot of spare primo gems. Remember, you'd never have to go for them, and they're definitely not worth the amount of money they cost. So, C1 is pretty good. It's nothing crazy, but it's also useful, so C2 is kind of useless. He has a 10-second cooldown, so usually you can only use it once per rotation. With C2, you can use it twice, and then once, and then twice, and then once, because you do 15-second rotations. So the fact that you have charges means that you can like go 2 with 20-second cooldown, then 1 with 10-second, and that ends up lining up with your rotations. You end up getting like 1 more E every 2 rotations. It doesn't matter that much. It's nice, it's useful, but it's not very good. C3 is pretty okay for freeze, but nothing crazy. C4 is pretty okay for freeze, but nothing crazy. C5 is really bad, and C6 is pretty good for melt. In general, I wouldn't go for Constellations on Ganyu. How does her melt team compare to other single target teams? The way that Melt Ganyu functions is you're kind of limited by the fact that your supports are going to need to use their bursts, and your supports have a certain amount of uptime and downtime, and you're going to need to battery them properly if you want to use their bursts again. So what ends up happening is that you get like 5, maybe 6 charge attacks, and then you gotta swap out and do your rotation again. In some shorter rotations, you get even less than that. So what ends up happening is you have a really good amount of like front-loaded damage while you're attacking, but your DPS over a long period of time isn't really anything crazy. Effectively, right, when you're a whale, you got a fucking C6 R5 Ganyu with like God Roll artifacts, you've got an R5 elegy on your supports, whatever, right? You got like all the stuff, then Melt Ganyu becomes one of the better speedrunning teams in the game in single target because it front loads its damage so well. But as a general rule, the power of like the team at a usual level is pretty much a little bit lower than what I would consider like the really good single target teams, but still a pretty solid one. Which is the least painful Melt Ganyu team to play. Bennett, Zhongli, Xiangling is generally going to be the most comfy one. If you want to start to get way too dank, you can go for stuff like Bennett, Zhongli, Kazuha, but it definitely gets pretty dank. Can you demonstrate how to double swirl with Kazuha and Melt Ganyu? No, because I don't have Ganyu on any of my accounts. I can't show you myself, but I will leave a link in the description below to a video by JStern25. I'll leave a link to his Melt Ganyu rotation that you can check out if you'd like to know how to double swirl with Kazuha. But effectively, the best way to do it is to time your stuff so that your E explosion happens right before you use Kazuha's burst. How important is Venti and Ganyu Freeze? It's not that he's necessary, it's just that like the only content where Ganyu Freeze is like better than the other teams you can play is Ventiable content. And if it's Ventiable content, Venti's obviously a lot better than the other choices. If you just like Ganyu and you want to play her, and you don't have Venti, then that's completely fine, right? Like, she's still very functional without him. Is there any merit to using Ganyu and Ayaka in the same team, or running Ganyu as a burst support in general? Yesn't. I'd say that if you're running a freeze teams, there's better batteries. If you're running a melt team, it's hard to make them both melt. So really, what teams are left is effectively just mono cryo. I don't like it because it's not better than freeze in basically any situation where freeze works, and if freeze doesn't work, then just don't play cryo. But it's still a very good team, and in mono cryo teams, then you can play Ayaka and Ganyu pretty well together. Or running Ganyu as a burst support in general, I would argue that the Ganyu carry teams with Venti are kind of just quick swap with a quote-unquote support Ganyu. You don't really use her charge attacks much when you have tight rotations, at least with Mona. With Kokomi, you can't get 15-second rotations because Kokomi's a 20-second cooldown, meaning that you have a little bit of time to charge shots during your rotation, but yeah. Does Ganyu enable the best possible fridge team alongside Kokomi? As of 3.0, I would say probably yeah, but also fridge teams aren't very good right now, so I wouldn't roll for Ganyu just for that. What happened to burning and its implications for Ganyu's melt team? Okay, I guess that's important. Before 3.0, the way that burning worked is every single time burning ticked, you reapplied pyro. And it wasn't just a small amount of pyro, it was a large amount of pyro. Right, you see I still have some Dendro left. Well, what would have happened before is that you would have actually ended up with Dendro and Pyro coexisting on the enemy. And then once the Dendro expired, you would have a Pyro aura. Effectively, by putting out that burning, you would still have some Pyro left that you can react with. And this is very important for Ganyu because when she charge attacks, applies Cryo twice. Now, it's only one unit of Cryo twice, so it's kind of like if I were using Diona instead. So when you use Diona, right, on a burning enemy, it doesn't put it out, but as you can see, right, the Pyro doesn't last for a very long time afterwards. The Pyro's already almost gone, and the reason why it even lasted at all is because Bennett is 2 units of Pyro. If I apply 1 unit of Pyro instead with Bennett's hold E, when it disappears, there's no aura left. So what that means is, before the nerf, what would have ended up happening is you trigger Melt, you remove your burning, but then there's still some Pyro underneath. So as long as you keep reapplying Dendro, you'll be fine, even if you put out your burning. But now, if your burning ever goes out, either by applying too much Cryo or just by expiring while you're melting stuff, you'll need to reapply Pyro. You can't just get away with re-adding more Dendro, which is something that you could have done before. In other words, in order to be able to sustain burning, now, you need to have incredibly fast Dendro application. And we just don't have that from off field right now. And so effectively, right, in order to actually be able to get value out of your burning, you just can't do it right now, unless you have off-field Pyro, at which point burning isn't adding anything. So you can't use it solo with what we have right now. But eventually we might get a burning, like, Dendro unit that actually works with burning, right? That's possible. The thing is, even when that happens, or if/when that happens, we still won't be able to apply as much Cryo as we would have been able to apply if they didn't change it. All this to say, don't use burning for Melt Ganyu. Maybe eventually we'll get a Dendro unit that just has like really good synergy with Ganyu, and then at that point, maybe you'll just run burning on your team because you want to run the Dendro unit. But for now, just no. Is Kokomi an upgrade to Mona in Ganyu Freeze, or is it not, thanks to the cooldowns? Yesn't. I would generally prefer Mona in Ganyu Freeze because of the cooldowns, because Mona's burst has a 15-second cooldown, which lines up a lot better with Ganyu's burst, which is also 15 seconds, and Diona's shield, which is 15 seconds, or Rosaria's burst, which is 15 seconds, and Kazuha's burst, which is 15 seconds. A lot of stuff that's 15 seconds that can line up. But if you're running Kokomi, then you're forced into 20 seconds instead. The reality, though, is that most people don't play perfect rotations and end up having a bit of downtime at the end of their rotations because they fucked something up, they missed the skill, they forgot to swap into a unit at some point. And so, in practice, most people won't actually notice the difference. Personally, I would prefer using Mona, though. Does she have any fun off-meta teams like Thundering Furious to Razor? Not really. She's a pretty straightforward unit. You can use her in Fridge, I guess. Curious as to what Fridge is, you can check out the fucking Dendro video. I think I talked about it there. Would I recommend Ganyu to newer players? Meh. She's a unit that you can go for if you like her, but she's far from necessary. But I think that does it. Have fun in 3.0. I'm excited for Sino, man. But yeah. So thank you for watching, YouTube, and I'll see you guys next time. See ya.
Oh hell! Born of ice and frost. Blaze over. This is long overdue.